Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Friday, February 28th, 2025 at 1:02 in the afternoon. So we are here to hopefully finish our discussions up on H-137, which is an act relating to the regulation of insurance products and services. Maria, I think first you have the draft changes, and then we'll look at language on the crypto piece that we're been talking about as well.
Is it? Bear with me a second.
It's good.
I don't know what happened.
Yes.
Maria Royal with Legislative Council. So we're going to walk through what's draft 1.5 of your proposed strike all amendment to H-137. And did you want to review all of the provisions? Or do you just want us to go to the, okay.
Yeah, let's look at the,
Okay, great. There aren't many. There are two that you specifically asked for. And then a couple of minor ones that DFR brought to my attention that I think you'll find favorable. So the two that you asked for both have to do with the studies. And you'll recall that additional time was requested by DFR. So the first study has to do with this was the issue about consumer protection related to transaction holds in the event of suspected fraud. So I think what you would wanted to do, instead of having the final report in draft form due November 15th, you wanted just a kind of a status report, preliminary findings and recommendations just to the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction, and that would give you some time to make a draft request by December, which is your deadline. And then the final report would be available January 15th. So identical change in the study on coerced debt, which you can see right there. It's on the bottom of page 25 onto page 26. And then the two suggestions that came from DFR were in section 19. This is regarding, yes.
On the coerced debt, since we have a bill on the wall already on that one, do we need the preliminary?
that's a good point.
Oh, that's true.
Not have extra work unnecessarily?
That is, well, that's true. I guess it depends how many changes there are. If it's something that requires a lot of drafting before January 15th, but I whatever you want to do, it's fine. I don't,
Well, I think, the thought was that just to put a short form in. So there you have a vehicle to move it in, but if we already have a vehicle, then I
yeah,
don't think we can just change that to January 15th on the report.
okay,
That's a good point, I thought.
okay. I will do that. So on the recommendation on genetic privacy, this is related to the direct-to-consumer companies that do genetic testing for ancestry or health purposes. One clarification from DFR was just to specify that this is for the purpose of preventing unfair genetic discrimination. Unfair. UNF. Okay, and then also DFR mentioned that the way it had read now is, among other things, the commissioner shall consider whether it is appropriate to allow a consumer to consent to sharing their information and change that around, so, to consider whether to require that the insurance company get consent prior to. In other words, the consumer should always be in control of whether they share their information. So I thought those were, good suggestions. So those are the only changes, and I can, revise that one on core stat to just January 15th.
Any questions, the language that Maria just showed us? Okay, Aaron, do you want to, does that all work for you now, the pushing that out to?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, and you're good with that language? It's in,
The genetic
yes,
language, yeah, Mary Block said that she requested that, so.
okay. Okay, good. I think the bill is fine now, just those, that one change. So now the question is the language on crypto kiosks.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe just a brief description about what I attempted to do since we last spoke about this issue. I think the way we left it based on the committee discussion was you wanted to see draft language that incorporates all of DFR's recommendation in their report. And then you also had a specific request around the refund provision. I believe you wanted CoinFlip, DFR, if they could reach some agreement on language. There's not agreement just yet, but I'll go over what's in this draft, and then DFR can speak to things that maybe they would like to see different in this draft. And then there were a few other things that were not in DFR's report, but were alluded to, and I think the committee was generally in favor of, for example, having a kiosk operator use blockchain technology, having a compliance offer, consumer protection. So those were things that were kind of discussed. So I took those provisions from a Massachusetts bill, actually, and incorporated them in here too. So, with that being said, we'll just walk through.
Yeah.
Okay. So just some definitions, at the beginning of the subchapter, there is a definition of Vermont law already for blockchain. So just to be consistent, I wanted to cross-reference that. The definition for blockchain analytics comes from, I think, the Massachusetts or maybe the Connecticut law, I can't remember. We'll just read through it. It means software service that uses data from various virtual currencies and their applicable blockchains to provide a risk rating specific to digital wallet addresses from users of virtual currency kiosks. Again, I think that's a pretty standard definition. And then also, just for greater clarification, defining digital wallet and digital wallet address. So a digital wallet means hardware or software that enables individuals to store and use virtual currency. And a digital wallet address means an alphanumeric identifier representing a destination on a blockchain for a virtual currency transfer that is associated with a digital wallet. The other two definitions. One is for existing customer and one is for new customer. And I'll just highlight that and those terms are used here with respect to disclosures, the refund policy, and I think something else, which I'm forgetting at the moment. But there's not agreement from the interested stakeholders as to whether or not these distinctions should be made. So I just wanted to highlight that. But for purposes of this draft, an existing customer is someone engaging in a transaction in Vermont who has been registered as a customer of the virtual currency operator, virtual currency kiosk operator for more than 72 hours. And a new customer is anyone who has been registered for not more than 72 hours. So just keep those in mind when we go through where they're relevant. So there is an existing section of law. What's a little bit tricky about the kiosk, virtual currency kiosk revisions is that there's in the money services virtual currency subchapter, there are general provisions that apply to all virtual currency transactions, not just at kiosks. So, it's amending different laws that are broader in scope, but then limiting to just the kiosks. So for example, with respect to receipts, refunds, disclosures, anyway, I just wanted to, it gets a little bit confusing, but I think everything is where it needs to be, at least for now. So in terms of the disclosures, specific to kiosk operators, I'm scrolling all the way down to, let's see. I'm going to get to the lead-in language on page 5. So in connection with any virtual currency transaction effected through a money transmission kiosk, so a virtual currency kiosk, or you'll see other transactions, then prior to effecting such a purchase or sale with or on behalf of a customer, a licensee shall prominently disclose and require the customer to acknowledge and confirm. And then again, this is existing law, type, value, date, precise time and amount of the transaction, the consideration charged for the transaction, including fees, any differences between the price paid and the prevailing market price. And then what the new language also includes for a customer virtual currency kiosks, a description of the virtual currency kiosk operator's refund policy. Also for kiosk customers, the customer warning described in subsection G of this section, which we'll look at momentarily. And 5, a statement of material risks associated with virtual currency transactions, which we'll also review in detail. So again, these are required disclosures before a transaction takes place. Also, included, I think there was discussion about wanting to have the contact information for DFR available at the kiosk. Again, prior to a transaction. So those are the new disclosures. And then subsection 5 relates to the receipt requirements. And so specifically for kiosk transactions, the operator shall provide a customer with both a paper and an electronic receipt for each transaction completed at the kiosk. And then in addition to the information required to be included on a receipt under the subsection we just read, or under the other statute that has receipt requirements, each receipt for a virtual currency transaction completed at a kiosk shall include the identification of any applicable digital wallet address to which virtual currency is transmitted, the full name of the account owner, any unique transaction identifiers, and a prominent statement of the virtual currency kiosk operator's refund obligations under this section in a form approved by the commissioner. So the warning that I referenced above, subsection G, has greater specificity about what is to be included in that customer warning or notice. And so in substantially similar form, you can see beginning on line 12, this is essentially what a customer would be presented with on the screen. Did you receive a phone call from your bank, software provider, the police, or were you directed to make a payment for Social Security, a utility bill, an investment warrant, or bail money at this kiosk? Implication is, if so, stop. And I believe this, I can't remember now if this came from I think this came from a Massachusetts bill. Is anyone on the phone pressuring you to make a payment of any kind? Line 18, I understand that the purchase and sale of cryptocurrency is a final, irreversible, and non-refundable transaction. And finally, I confirm I am sending funds to a wallet I own or directly have control over. And I confirm that I am using funds gained from my own initiative to make my transaction. So with respect to the statement of material risks that must be disclosed, they shall include one, a statement that virtual currency is not legal tender, is not backed by the government, and accounts and value balances are not subject to FDIC or Securities Investor Protection Corporation protections, insurance protections. 2, legislative and regulatory changes or actions at the state, federal, or international level may adversely affect the use, transfer, exchange, and value of virtual currency. 3, transactions in virtual currency may be irreversible, and accordingly, losses due to fraudulent or accidental transactions may not be recoverable. 4, some virtual currency transactions shall be deemed to be made when recorded on a public ledger, which is not necessarily the date or time that the customer initiates the transaction. 5, the value of virtual currency may be derived from the continued willingness of market participants to exchange fiat currency for virtual currency, which may result in the potential for permanent and total loss of value of a particular virtual currency should the market for that virtual currency disappear. 6, there's no assurance that a person who accepts a virtual currency as payment today will continue to do so in the future. 7, the volatility and unpredictability of the price of virtual currency relative to fiat currency may result in significant loss over a short period of time. 8, the nature of virtual currency may lead to an increased risk of fraud or cyber attack. 9, the nature of virtual currency means that any technological difficulties experienced by the virtual currency kiosk operator may prevent the access or use of a customer's virtual currency. And finally, 10, any bond or trust account maintained by the virtual currency kiosk operator for the benefit of its customers may not be sufficient to cover all losses incurred by customers. So then Section 3 is a statute that is specific to virtual currency kiosk operators. This is a statute that you amended or enacted, last year. Subsection B is the daily transaction limit. DFR did not propose to increase that limit from $1,000. I don't think there's consensus on that, so that's probably something you can revisit. However, under the fee cap proposal, you'll see that under existing law, it shall not exceed the greater of the following $5, or an existing law is 3%. And I believe you can hear from DFR that they were amenable to increasing it to 15%, provided all of the other protections were enacted, recognizing that there would be increased costs associated with them. And then C, I think it's just a technical fix referencing the definition of single transaction applying to both subsections A and B. The licensing requirement is the same. The operator accountability is the same. Then, so under subsection F, there's lifting the moratorium, so there's no longer a moratorium. But there's a new provision concerning customer identification. And it specifies that for each transaction occurring at a kiosk in this state, the kiosk operator shall correctly verify the identity of the customer prior to accepting payment from the customer. An operator shall not allow a customer to engage in any transaction at a kiosk under any name, account, or identity other than the customer's own true name and identity. And a kiosk operator shall be strictly liable for any violation of this subsection. A kiosk operator shall obtain a copy of a government-issued identification card that identifies the customer and shall collect additional customer information, including the customer's name, date of birth, telephone number, address, and email address prior to accepting any payment from a customer at a kiosk. Then subsection G, so deleting the report that was just done this year and providing a new subsection on customer support. And this is having available basically a live toll-free number during the hours of operation of the kiosk and displaying that number, toll-free number on the kiosk or on the screen of the kiosk. And then as part of the DFR's recommendations regarding mandatory live screenings, these would apply to, and this means that the operator shall identify and speak by telephone with a new customer. So that's where the definition of new might come into play if you keep that. Over 60 years of age, prior to such new customer's first virtual currency transaction with the kiosk operator, or any customer attempting to conduct $50 in virtual currency transactions during any consecutive 10-day period. Subdivision 2 just specifies that whether that transaction is approved is determined by the operator based on its assessment of the communication under the live screening. The operator is required to record and retain a copy of each live screening. And then in particular, what should be addressed during the live screening, the operator shall A, positively identify the customer, reconfirm any attestations made by the customer at the kiosk, discuss the purpose of the transaction, and discuss types of fraudulent schemes relating to virtual currency. I is the requirement that the operator use blockchain analytics, and I think you heard about how they can use that to identify transactions in digital wallets and whether there are red flags associated with an address. This goes on to specify that the commissioner may request evidence from any virtual currency kiosk operator of its current use of blockchain analytics. And then the refund provision for new customers, this is a full refund. So not just the fee, refunding the fees. This would be a full refund for any, again, new customer that specifies on a new customer's request, an operator shall issue a refund to a new customer for the full amount of any fraudulent virtual currency transaction made within the 72-hour new customer period, including any associated fees, provided that the customer within 14 days of the last fraudulent transaction in that 72-hour period reports the fraud to a government or law enforcement agency, and within 24 hours of reporting to a government agency or law enforcement reports to the kiosk operator. It occurred to me that that language, you might not want to specify that that has to happen 24 hours after reporting to law enforcement, as long as it doesn't occur any later than that. I think that's the intent. Anyway.
Later.
Yeah. And then for any other customers, they are entitled to a fee refund with respect to fraudulent transactions. So if they're not eligible as a new customer, and they can get that fee refund within 6 months following the fraudulent transaction, provided the customer reports to a government or law enforcement agency and to the kiosk operator. So I think you'll hear more from DFR, their thoughts about the refund provisions. And anyway, and so L is a separate, just requires that the operators have anti-fraud policies in place that at a minimum include the identification and assessment of fraud-related risk areas, procedures and controls to protect against identified risks, allocation of responsibility for monitoring risks, and procedures for the periodic evaluation and revision of the anti-fraud procedures, controls, and monitoring mechanisms. M is a requirement that they maintain a due diligence policy, or what's called an enhanced due diligence policy, that's reviewed and approved by the operator's board of directors or an equivalent governing body. And the policy identifies at a minimum individuals who are at risk of fraud based on age or mental capacity. N is just a requirement that they have written compliance policies and procedures that are reviewed by the board of directors or other governing body. O is the requirement that they have a compliance officer qualified to coordinate and monitor compliance with this section and other applicable federal and state laws, and is employed full-time by the operator, and is not an individual who owns more than 20% of the kiosk operator by whom the individual is employed. And then in terms of the officer's compliance responsibilities, just specifies that those responsibilities shall be completed by one or more full-time employees of the operator. And then finally, subsection P is a requirement for the operator to have a consumer protection officer. Designate and employ such officer who meets the following requirements, is qualified to coordinate and monitor compliance with this section and other applicable state and federal laws and regulations, is employed full-time, and is not, again, an individual who owns more than 20% of the operator. So that is the proposal.
Prefer not to have this in 137.
We're not there yet.
Okay.
Can you go back to J1? It's on page 15, it's. Just
Refund.
trying to understand, provided the customer within 15 days after the last transaction to occur during the 72-hour new customer. I guess I'm not understanding what that means.
So if there's a fraudulent, you're a new customer, and if you have that 72-hour window,
We request to
if there's a fraudulent transaction, that,
figure out that it's fraud.
right, so you have 14 days after that transaction. If there were several of them, whenever the last fraudulent transaction was, right, there might have been a couple in that. So the clock starts ticking whenever the last, there might have only been one, but
Just, well, this is from Minnesota. This is the Minnesota language that they passed last year.
Just for the record, Larry.
Sorry, Larry, the front foot. Apologies.
although I'm looking at this now and it just specifies the last transaction to occur in the 72 hours. So it could be your last transaction, whether it's fraudulent or not, but that's the point when you start counting the days you have to report.
That's what happens on your first day.
Still confused with this 14 days on the 72-hour new customer period. How that works, so if I made several transactions,
In 72 hours, your initial 72 hours,
and I had 14 days to ask for,
yes. In 2 weeks. And yeah, so this is one of the areas where I think there's some difference of opinion, so you'll hear more about that.
Can you go back to the place where it talks about the person
the intervention, as I call it, where if they charge 5,000,
Live screening.
yeah, I mean, doesn't that seem like it's too little too late? Because at this point, they've already conducted $4,000 in, because it says in a consecutive 10-day period, which means that I go in, I send $1,000, and the next day I send another $1,000. And by the time somebody says something, well, I've already lost $4,000.
I think that's a policy choice, you know.
I mean, to me, it wouldn't make sense.
Well, when we get to, we can ask
Okay.
the department, we can ask the proposer.
Language questions?
Mhm.
So on page 2, line 3. What are the implications of not having the word kiosk in there?
That Maria needs more sleep, maybe?
Oh,
So what line was this?
line 3.
Has been registered as a customer of virtual currency. Yeah, there should be a kiosk in there. This literally was done, so bear with me on some of them. No, but
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
I noted that as well. Oh, okay, yeah,
I have
okay.
A few more, but I'm happy to.
Has this gone through editing at all?
Not the very, it was this morning, but it's changed since this morning, so.
You have another one?
Yeah. On page 6, line 12, there is a reference to requiring a description of the virtual currency kiosk operator's refund policy. How does that interact with page 8, line 18, where there is the customer notice is asserting that it's a non-refundable transaction?
I think it has to do with fraudulent activities, that you can get a refund if there's, I believe. That's a good question, but I think that's, that you can get a refund only if you meet it's fraudulent, you reported it.
I have a few others, but I don't.
Go ahead, run through.
So page 13, line 2. In which the operator shall obtain a copy of a government issued identification card. I hadn't even thought about this. Does this mean that businesses can access these services? Businesses, I just.
Yeah. I don't know. I had not thought about that, but I think so I have to go back and look, see if these provisions apply to any person or it's specific to individuals, consumer, but I think that's a great thing to clarify. I'm not certain.
I have one more.
Sure. No, this is helpful because I hadn't even thought of that, so.
And that's on page 14, line 12. Where we are determining that they shall record and retain a copy of each mandatory live screening. If that's like a video you could watch, maybe this is a policy thing, but do those is that for, the way it's written, that's forever?
That's a great point. I actually that did occur to me, whether you want that to be retained for a year, 5 years, whatever. But yeah, no, I think that's a great.
Those were, thanks.
Yeah, covered it.
Okay.
Herb?
You want me to stop the share?
No, not yet. Herb did have his hand up, I'm not sure.
He's muted.
Is Alvin's muted?
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I had my hand up, but I took it down. I was looking at the refund section and trying to count up the days and the hours and, what would be subject to the refund, but I think I got that figured out.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Maria. Why don't we hear from Larry?
You're welcome.
Sorry about this. Patrick Chow.
All right.
Hi, Larry Lipka, Coin Flip. Good to see all of you again. Happy to answer any questions.
Were you able to get that information about the longevity of the money in the wallet that it goes to?
No.
There's some areas where you're thinking of a little different than what's in the draft right now.
Yeah, so and then I'll just answer a couple of questions. So there was some reference to the Massachusetts bill. So, that is our bill that we've got proposed in the Senate and in the House in Massachusetts. So happy with that language, obviously. We do not service businesses at our kiosks. I think that is a more complicated process to verify ownership, and you need to collect a lot of documents. So it's just not feasible at the kiosk. We have an order desk where businesses can transact with us, and we would direct any of those business consumers to our order desk instead. And there was a question about how long to retain the recording of the warnings and disclosures. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, we're required to retain that information for 5 years. So a solution would be to say, as required under the Bank Secrecy Act, because in that, if that ever changes, then the bill would change as well. So I think those are some simple things. And, the only area right now, there's 2 areas that, we have a disagreement on as written in the bill. And I think one area that's in the bill that I think we disagree with DFR. So the first is right now, there's a provision requiring paper receipts and email receipts and digital receipts. So we sort of think that's overkill. And the way the receipt is written right now, I'm a little uncomfortable with the paper receipt because it requires, the full name of the account owner, the transaction identifiers, the amount of the transaction. So if somebody is not careful with that receipt and leaves it behind, then anybody who finds it will know that somebody owns cryptocurrency. And there's all of those warnings that we're saying about the risk of fraud and the risk of hacking and all that stuff. So you're actually setting up for scam artists to stake out these kiosks. And when someone throws out their paper receipt, then they can be scammed themselves, right? And, for just to be clear, we don't have printers at our machines right now. There's only 3 kiosks in Vermont. So if we had to do it, we could do it. But, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. It's like when you go to an ATM, who hasn't seen the paper receipt sticking out, and those don't have their name on it or anything. It just has the amount it's in account. So that is my concern about a paper receipt. So I would recommend that be removed.
Oh, sorry.
That is on page 6. Starting on page 6, I believe. Oh, wait, 7. Yeah. Yeah, 7, line 20. So 19 and 20, it says, both a paper and electronic receipt. And electronic makes sense because it goes to the person's cell phone number that they've registered with. And the fact that we're requiring someone to provide their ID at the kiosk for every transaction means that the person in front of the kiosk, the cell phone number they provide will be their cell phone number. So they're always going to be getting that receipt. And with live customer service, if somebody loses their text message, I don't know how that would happen, actually deletes it, you could call customer service and get a copy of your receipt or your transaction. So the paper receipt just seems sort of risky and probably against Vermont policy in terms of reducing pollution and waste and, cutting down trees, this beautiful state with all these trees. Do you want to add to that problem? I know it's a tiny little receipt, but that's just, I think, a minor thing that I think could be taken care of, especially with the name on it. That's just very troubling to me. The other issue I have is with the $1,000 daily transaction limit. The last bill that I was working off of, I thought that it was, amended to 2,000 and 5,000, 2,000 for new users, 5,000 for existing users. And that is the Connecticut model. We're copying the Minnesota model for refunds. And in Minnesota, the new users is 2,000 and there's no limit for existing users other than federal limits. So with all of these protections in here, this would be the most protections for any cryptocurrency transaction in the world, most likely, because you have to take ID and you also have to refund scam victims for those first 3 transactions. So I'm not quite clear why there is a $1,000 daily limit for everybody. The industry would agree to a reasonable transaction limit for new users, which would be my advice is 2,000. That's what Connecticut and Minnesota have passed. And that's because of the suspicious activity reporting threshold is $2,000. So when the level is lower than $2,000, the federal government gets less of those SARs and therefore the federal government has less ability to investigate and stop scammers if they are in fact scamming people. And if we are required to, and we're agreeing to this, the refund provision, if we're required to refund those victims, then what problem are we trying to solve with such a low limit for everybody? So, we're willing to be reasonable, but why is the same limit applying to somebody who's used our kiosk for weeks or months or years? They know what they're doing. And if they want to buy that amount of crypto, along with, giving their ID, and we're going to have to call them if they want to buy more than a certain amount in a certain number of days, like there's just no harm to any consumer with that. So, that is like the strongest point I want to make is it just is completely unfair to require all of this, but then still keep $1,000 daily transaction limit. And then I think the other area where we disagree with DFR on it, and we're willing to compromise on that, is in the refund provision itself. We had talked about this when I testified last time about, the issue is where customers are not telling us that they've been defrauded. They're just telling the police or they're just telling a governmental entity. So that makes our hold periods less effective because we then would have to hold the crypto for at least like 15 days after their last transaction. And the point of crypto is that it's an instantaneous transaction. So our customers won't like that. But, we're willing to compromise on that. If this committee does not like having customers report within that 24-hour period, then, we can remove it. But, that is a burden on our company because if we hold for 72 hours, the person reports to law enforcement right away the next day after they realize they've been scammed, doesn't report to us, we release that crypto, then we're out that crypto and we're out the money that's in the kiosk as well. So this is not a way to like trick consumers. This was just my way to try to add some fairness to it, right? So, happy to discuss that and, take your thoughts and questions. And those are really the only areas where there's any concern from PointFlip.
So on that latter point, you could release instantaneously, but the only way to do that is for your business to assume all of the risk.
Correct.
Okay, so that's a choice you could make, but that would be
Correct.
okay.
Yeah, and I think that, this is the refund provision is a good way for the crypto company. They can make that risk decision themselves. If their customers really want the crypto right away, then you could call them, like we're already going to have to call people 60 or plus to see why they're transacting, or you can take more identifying information. You can take steps to make sure that that person isn't getting scammed. So I think it is a good idea that Minnesota had in enacting this refund provision, but then pairing it with, a low limit for the new users to protect them along with the refund. And then existing users, it is the federal limits or the limit established by the kiosk operator. And right now there is no federal limit for kiosk operators. That may change at some point. Senator Durbin has proposed a bill. It probably won't go anywhere because he's a Democrat and he doesn't have any power right now. But, there's also the federal gift card level, which is somewhat analogous because it's the same risk level, and that's $10,000 a day. So we would say it should be at least 10,000 for existing users because the federal government has already analyzed this risk issue. And, the same types of scams that could happen at kiosks could happen with gift cards. That's the phone call from somebody telling you to do something. And if not, you're going to get arrested. They get you in a panic, and then you can buy the gift cards and you can electronically send them to somebody overseas, like immediately. So that's my thoughts. And the other thing that it just, so we have all the information, is the currency transaction report level is 10,000 or more, or is more than 10,000. So if you want currency transaction reports to be filed at kiosk operators, maybe it should be 10,500 rather than 10,000, so that people aren't forced to what's called in compliance structure their transactions. Structuring is when somebody tries to evade some sort of information gathering by staying below a certain threshold over time. So an example would be we take ID at $960 right now for all customers. And if someone's doing $940 or $900 over it constantly, eventually that'll flag and you'll have to give your ID even though you're not reaching that $960 in one transaction.
So when you weren't able to get the information in the time, is that correct?
I think that's part, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, or was it that you can't get the information?
I guess I'm just a little confused as to it. We couldn't get it in the time. And also I'm confused as to what exactly the data that you need is, right? Because at our company, it's very difficult because we batch transactions. So when transactions happen, we use a company that batches them. So it's a complicated blockchain transaction history. So it's not just like a click of a button to see how long has this crypto remained in that wallet. And, respectfully and frankly, like that data doesn't really show anything because as we talked about, people can buy crypto and then immediately send it somewhere else. And that's not a fraudulent transaction. They could be buying something, they could be sending it to somebody else. People sometimes have lots of wallets because they don't want all of their crypto in one particular wallet. But what our system does flag is if somebody transfers crypto to a high risk wallet after it's been transferred to their wallet, if they then transfer it a year later even and it goes to a high risk wallet, that's flagged and a SAR will be reported and that person will be blacklisted so they can't transact further. So there's already an internal control to prevent people from sending to high risk wallets even after they've transacted with us. So this is the benefit of the blockchain for law enforcement and for companies like mine is that you can trace the transactions even after the transaction with your client. So like a bank, if you take money out, the bank knows you took that money out, but if you hand it to a robber or a drug dealer on the street, the bank doesn't know that because they can't monitor that transaction. Whereas we can monitor because if a customer was to transfer the crypto to a wallet that's been identified as being owned by a drug dealer, that would be flagged as a high risk wallet. And then that customer would be blocked from transacting with us again.
So as I explained my reasoning for wanting that information, and I guess I'm just reiterating what I was saying before, so I guess it's not really necessary.
Herb?
Yes. So Larry, good to see you again. Yeah, I'm behind you. Sorry about that.
Yes. Hello.
A couple of things. First, I think you and your company are good actors. I would never think that you were trying to trick anyone. It's all about, from my perspective, anyway, it's all about trying to minimize, fraudulent transactions and people getting taken advantage of. So that's the only, from my perspective, that's the intent of all these regulations that you think, that I'm sure you consider kind of onerous. The question, I guess, a couple of questions. So there are certain currency limitations where you have to report to the federal government. Aren't those required for perhaps a fundamentally different purpose in that the federal government wants to be able to enforce their currency their currency requirements and laws, whereas in this field, isn't it more a different kind of regulatory or public interest in terms of trying to prevent fraud to begin with, Larry?
So I think I understand the question. So I would say that you're right, it's the suspicious activity reporting threshold of 2,000. That is an anti-fraud threshold because the law enforcement can access the database for suspicious activity reports that money service businesses submit to FinCEN, the federal regulator for money service businesses. So when they're investigating crimes, including, that could be money laundering, right? It could be someone committing a crime like drug dealers, or it could be someone who's been defrauded. That's the way that money service businesses report to the government and thus all law enforcement that somebody has been scammed. And that's the way that law enforcement can then investigate and stop that from happening again. And we often get what's called Bank Secrecy Act requests for the SAR backup files. So that's when law enforcement has done a search of the database, identifies that this SAR is relevant to their investigation. So they then want all of the data, all of the documents that are relevant to that. And then we share that with law enforcement. So I would say that $2,000 limit is in fact a fraud limit, but the $10,000 currency transaction report, I think that's more about money laundering and catching like financial crimes. So people, if they're buying $10,000 of crypto, or if they're buying $10,001, that's an indication that, where did that money come from? The federal government can then make a decision whether that person's evading taxes or laundering money or doing something that they shouldn't with that cash.
It just seems to me, Larry, that in this context of trying to prevent fraud as opposed to, the feds wanting to enforce fraud, enforce things after the transactions occurred. They're really kind of different considerations in mind. And the 1,000 doesn't, it seems to me anyway, Larry, that the 1,000 isn't, there are two different purposes going on here. And I think that's the reason why our department, I'll ask them, but I would think that's the reason why our department is looking at a different amount than the federal government is. I have one other question for Larry, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
The refund issue, Larry, is real important to me personally. And I totally understand that it's a problem for your company. It just remains a real problem for me. We have different time periods that have been floated around. Some states have no refund period. I think other states, maybe Connecticut, I think it was, had 72 hours or something. The DBR report initially had a 7-day period. The AARP is looking for a 30-day period. And of course, the AG isn't real keen on this at all. So I assume that that's the way they would deal with the refund issue. How do you help us sort out, Larry, what refund period is appropriate from our standpoint of trying to protect consumers from fraudulent transactions?
Sure. So I think that's a policy decision by this committee, right? We're proposing 14 days because that's what Minnesota has passed. So it obviously could be longer, but the longer it is, the more onerous it is on a company. And I would say that this bill, as drafted, would be the premier crypto, not just crypto kiosk, crypto protection bill in the country. So when you have the premier bill that has all of these protections, calling people, like taking their ID to make sure that the person in front of it, it's a balance. And right now, I think the 14 days is sort of in the middle of what's being proposed. So it seems like it's a compromise. And, just going back to like the refund plus the daily transaction limit, I still don't understand, what are we trying to protect by keeping it at $1,000 per day for everybody when we're agreeing, CoinFlip is saying we agree with the refund provision. We will refund scam victims, and then it is up to us to prevent them from getting scammed. Otherwise, we have to refund them the whole amount, and they're made whole. So, there is not a risk then to customers in Vermont because they will be made whole if they have been defrauded.
I have some other thoughts, but I don't want to monopolize, so I'm gonna lower my hand.
Question.
Emily.
Yeah, or Emily.
Emily?
Hi. I guess on just a sort of question, maybe point of clarification on this whole $1,000 limit. My understanding from this conversation with regards to consumer protection is that the idea on keeping the number a little bit lower is because we are worried about folks that are a little bit more vulnerable and are concerned about the possibility for scams. So having that kind of customer check-in, I guess from my perspective, I would say like having a little bit more frequent customer interaction, customer contact to ensure that folks are actually able to use the funds and are not getting scammed. I think that's some of my thought for having a little bit more of a having that $1,000 check-in.
Yeah, I mean, if the state wants it to be 1,000 for new users, I still would push that it should be higher for existing users. Those people are not at risk of being defrauded. They have been using our machines and they know what they're doing, right? And I say that You can never say everything with 100%. Obviously, people fall through the cracks. And even after all of this, is it possible that someone gets scammed? Yes. But the stuff in this bill is basically what CoinFlip does already. And in the state of Vermont, there has been one scam victim, and that scam victim was made whole by us. And this bill would require that for all operators to do what we're doing. So we're talking about a very small amount of fraud that would get through this. You know, I strongly urge it to be 2,000 because of the SAR threshold, but if the state makes the decision for it to be 1,000 for new users, it should still be higher for existing users because, you know, what are we trying to protect at that point when we've done all of these things in this bill that we're agreeing to?
Oh yeah. I guess I would say I don't think it's necessarily on you all, or in regards to you being bad actors. And I do understand certainly if folks are using these products regularly, I get it. I think some of the concern for me is also knowing the consumer psychology of people not necessarily reporting. Even if we put up all the signs and everything, there's so much shame attached to financial crimes that that they go largely underreported. So even if you have an existing user, if something is happening with them, are they going to report?
Sure. I mean, I can't answer that because I can't get in the mind of people, but I'm telling you, like, who here who hasn't had their credit card stolen, right? If you saw a fraudulent transaction on your credit card, are you going to not report it to get a refund because you're embarrassed that someone stole your credit card? Of course, that may happen. But if if this refund policy is disclosed to you, you know you can get your money back because it's been disclosed. You're not going to ask for a refund. That seems crazy to me.
I just want to take us in a little bit of a different direction. On your kiosks, you have read this information, and if any of, stop, right? If any of these things have happened.
Yeah.
Is there an easy exit? Like, I didn't notice that was a thing. I thought, it just felt like continue is this big box, but there's no like stop, cancel transaction, anything like that. And I feel like that's a piece that is missing here. And I'm wondering how hard that would be to add in.
I'm just going to grab this here that has the picture. So, I don't know if everyone can see this. So this is our scam warning, and it has like all the warnings that say, and then these are all like, it's not exactly the same that's in this bill, but they're similar. And it says if you answer yes in these, stop. And it says, select OK to continue, right? We can change that, right? And we're constantly changing this and improving it. So the answer to your question is yes, we can make changes, right? It could say,
I'm just wondering
Yeah.
if we write that into the bill, that's what you're opposed to.
No. And I think some of our competitors do it that way in other states where it's like, are you sending to somebody else? Yes, no. If they say yes, then the transaction is stopped. But, frankly, the person could just sort of restart the transaction and then hit no, right?
But you're recording them.
Yeah.
So you can see that that's happening, and somebody could, there could be flags, right? Like, I would, if I were running the business, I would not want to have to refund money. So I would be paying attention to things like.
Yeah, of course. And that's what the purpose of the refund is, right? Yeah. And, we're open to suggestions, right? We work with a lot of states. I testify all over the place. And everyone has like a different idea of what is the best way to protect consumers. What are the best disclosures? There is no right answer, right? It's just having a cadre of tools that all together will prevent like 99% of it, right? If you talk to the AARP, which we do, they have a different idea. The AARP is not going to like that you have to call people 60 plus before they can transact. They fought us vigorously on that. And we're like, why are you fighting that? This is to protect people that are your demographic. But they don't like that because elderly people are being treated differently than everyone else, right? So even the AARP disagrees with the state of Vermont on something that I would consider a consumer protection. So, I mean, the answer to your question is if you want it that way, then sure, right? We have to be careful to not be too
I'm not
prescriptive.
Regular check boxes where you just get into the habit
Right.
of check.
Yeah.
I just want something that like yes isn't bigger than the opt out. That's all.
Sure. And happy to any suggestions, ideas, we're happy to implement them.
Just wanted to make sure it wasn't too complicated.
And that's always the balance, right? Like can't have too many disclosures or people just don't read them. And that's why we have like the separate scam disclosure on its own screen, like just these 6 questions, right? Because you could probably have thousands of these types of questions.
One, did you provide that to everybody? I know I got a copy of that.
So I can email this if,
You want me to email it to Anna?
yeah, I think, yeah, we got an electronic copy.
Okay, I just forwarded it to her because I had it from Heather. You could do, it's called waterfall questions where it requires, because a block of questions and then it makes it easy for someone to just click, okay. But
Right. I mean, I totally agree with you, right? There's a lot of ways to improve. We're always trying to improve. But at some point, like if you've got 20 scam screens, like the customer's just going to walk away and then no one's going to use the product because it's so annoying, right?
I want you to realize I don't think you guys are bad actors. I just want to be.
No, I understand that.
My concern is more about how people are using the product that you have. It has nothing to do with what you guys are doing. I need to make that very clear. Yeah.
Emily?
Thank you. Just getting back to the receipts issue, is there a way to, I guess I would say like somewhat anonymize the receipts so that a paper receipt would be a little safer?
Sure. Right. And not having a name on there would probably be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Larry? Okay. Oh, Herb?
Yeah, Larry, I thought I wanted to clarify. I think something that well, 2 things. Are you okay with the refund provision that's in this draft, Larry? And then I want a clarification as to something you said.
Yes, we're okay with the refund provision in this. And we're also okay, I suggested that 24-hour language where somebody has 24 hours after they report to the police to report to us. That was a suggestion. And I'm learning we were exchanging emails very quickly the last couple of days. So I don't think that my agreement to remove that got to you, which is fine, right? So, if DFR doesn't like that, then we remove that. And then we're at a refund provision that DFR likes and will accept, right? We don't like it, obviously, but we will accept it because this is the way for the industry to prove and for CoinFlip to prove we're putting our money where our mouth is because we're going to refund scam victims.
Yeah, and so, thank you, Larry. And the other sort of clarification, I think I picked up in your earlier statements that it was a 14-day refund period, but I'm reading it more as a short 72-hour, but then you have 14 days to report it. Isn't that correct?
Correct. Yes. And I apologize if I misspoke about that, but yes, that's
no,
right.
That's fine. No, I understand.
So, all right, I'll ask the same question of DFR in a moment, but can I hear a little bit about in what way does information sent to, or the suspicious activities reports assist you or enhance your business's activities?
So the suspicious activity reports, probably don't enhance our business. That's for the federal government for law enforcement, right? But when we submit a SAR, a suspicious activity report, that's after we've done an investigation to identify that there has in fact been suspicious activity. So if we identify a customer who has engaged in something that they shouldn't or has been defrauded, that customer is no longer able to transact with us until perhaps they explain what they've done. So it's sort of the chicken or the egg, right? Like the investigation is what helps our company to prevent fraud and make sure that customer doesn't get defrauded again. And then we also blacklist the wallets that customer has used if they have been involved in something that is suspicious. And then we submit those wallets to the blockchain analytics companies so that other companies that use blockchain analytics will know that no one should be sending to this wall because something suspicious happened.
And then in your participation in SAR, I think I heard the phrase money service business, that would be your industry type.
Yes.
Would these be considered, what would the instrument types or payment mechanism be in here? These aren't money orders, are they funds transfers?
Yeah, I'm not sure of that technicality, and I think I don't know the answer because the FinCEN rules were drafted for fiat currency dollars, and they have not been updated specifically to apply to crypto companies and to like crypto transactions. So I think it is a funds transfer is the category.
That answer leads me to ask then, is the SAR participation even relevant if these haven't been up, if these are tied to fiat currency? Does it inform their understanding of or ability to assist in this realm of currency exchange?
So while the regulations haven't been updated by FinCEN recently to address crypto, it is clear that they apply to you as a money service business. It's clear for if you aren't registered with FinCEN and you're not submitting SARs, you're committing violations of the law, and your chief compliance officer is going to go to jail, and probably the owners of your company as well. And my company has been registered with FinCEN since the beginning of its, 10 years ago.
I got it. Okay. Thank you.
I think I answered your question, but
Yeah.
okay.
I think it's a really basic question. Just to show my lack of full understanding of the process. So when there's been suspicious activity in a wallet, and you basically you close that wallet, or you hold that wallet, you tag. Is the identity of the owner of that wallet what is getting flagged, or is it just that wallet? Because my understanding is you can create multiple wallets.
Correct. So, sorry, were you done?
No, that's.
Yeah, so, that is a limitation of blockchain analytics, right? Is that somebody can create what is called in the industry a virgin wallet that has not been used before, that would be ranked as a medium risk wallet because it has no transaction history. So like I said before, it's about the cadre of tools. No one tool is going to stop all fraudulent activity, but all of them combined will. And I know that my company stops thousands of transactions since we started using blockchain analytics, since they were invented. And that is preventing those consumers from being defrauded. But we also have, the scam warnings and live 24-hour day customer service that also blocks some transactions. And also when someone tells us, you collect more information from someone, the more crypto they buy. So when somebody buys $1,000, you're not going to be asking them, the source of their funds, the reason for their transaction, and you're not going to be asking them for proof of their funds either, because it's a risk-based approach in compliance. And at $1,000, that's a very low risk transaction because it's a low amount. So we also catch fraud when we ask someone, why are you buying crypto? And they say, I'm sending it to pay my granddaughter's bail on the phone. And then we know that that's not a proper purpose. And we block them from transacting and, ask them follow-up questions and explain to them, because our customer service agents are trained, explain to them that you can't do that, because if you just block them, they'll hang up and then go do it somewhere else or buy gift cards or something. And then they still lose their money. So you're understanding blockchain analytics, that you understood that question.
Questions for Larry? Larry, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Ethan, would you?
I was gonna defer to our expert, Ethan.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Ethan McLaughlin, I'm Assistant General Counsel with the Department of Financial Regulation. And just before I get started, are there any sort of time constraints on this I should be aware of?
Well, at 3:00, we have a meeting with the speaker, so.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, you don't have a hard stop in 10 minutes before I, launch into something versus taking your question. So just at the outset, what I say in meetings over the last few years, I've heard this committee, repeatedly, question what the public good of allowing these kiosks in the state was, and that being a question that you've wrestled with. And I think that's a very important question to wrestle with. And I think in part because one of the things you're trying to assess right now is whether there's some public good from allowing it that outweighs the risk of harm. And to the extent there's not, can you mitigate the risk of harm through these things that we're proposing to an extent that comes into balance such that the public good is greater? And I'd encourage you to keep engaging in that balancing process or weighing process. In our kiosk report, one of the things that we started with at the outset, and that I want to call your attention back to, and because there are pages of this before we get to our recommendations, and that is why the original protections were put in place, and why there might be a need for additional protections. So in the report, we call your attention to the Attorney General's comment letter, where they voice their support of extending the moratorium. And there are really, I thought, damning statistics that they provide about the extent to which these kiosks are used in transactions where Vermonters are victimized by frauds and scams. I don't remember the exact criteria off the statistic that they mentioned, but I remember that it took my breath away reading it in the letter, how high it was, the extent to which kiosks were involved in the complaints and reports that they have received. There's also the federal reports that we cite in there, and the and something you'll see repeatedly is this also belief that there's vast underreporting of these scams and frauds, that we have numbers on the reported numbers, but almost everyone involved in this space believes the actual numbers are far higher. So everyone involved in this space on the regulatory or law enforcement side of it, things. So, to the extent you lift the moratorium, that will result in more kiosks. More kiosks, I think, is likely to result in more victims of scams using these. And the question is whether the things we put, if you can put into place things in the law that DFR would enforce, that would again that would mitigate it. Now, a lot of these things that are in there that are new, that weren't in our report, we were aware of those. We didn't necessarily suggest them in our report because we were opting with the much stronger and more robust refund requirement, with the idea being that, look, if you shift the burden to these companies so that they're on the hook for the scams, they will take appropriate measures to guard against it. To the extent a lot of these new measures represent the status quo, or at least the status quo for conscientious operators, we have no reason they are better than nothing. They're good. We do not object to including them in the law, but we also don't think that they're adequate alone, right? The provisions that we recommended in the report, we think, are the most important ones if the legislature is not going to extend the moratorium, and if it decides not to go with an outright ban, which is still something for you to consider, and that DFR doesn't state a position on. So I want to talk about a couple of the things that we talked about today, because I suspect there was a little confusion on our part in terms of the process for all of the changes that were made for the bill. Some we are fine with. Some of what was presented is not necessarily what we would like to see if there was going to be something. So I was just going to talk about to sort of go through and order a couple of things that came up. So on the paper receipt, I take Larry's point that, there are some dangers to having, personal information on this paper receipt that people might be able to find, pull out of the machine, pull out of the trash can. The reason that we
Sorry, that's my sugar.
included that paper receipt requirement is that one of the ways people circumvent the daily transaction limits is that they give customers accounts to use at these machines, existing identity verified accounts that have been oftentimes set up in other states. And they say, use this username and password or this code and go in and transact under this account. And they, deceive the customers into doing this. But when they do that and they transact under an account that is not their own, the customer does not get that electronic receipt, right? It goes to the address associated with whoever set up that account, and which might not be the address of the customer. And we had heard from regulators in other states that they thought the paper transaction receipt was important because they said they had anecdotal reports from victims where the first time they realized they'd been victimized was when they got the receipt and someone else's name was on it. It wasn't their name on it, and it wasn't the sheriff department's name on it or the IRS. It was someone they'd never heard of. So that's where the paper receipt was coming from. I don't think that that's something that we feel incredibly strongly about the paper receipt. If you say, well, there are downsides to this paper receipt in terms of personal information and privacy, and we think those, offset the benefits from that, DFR, I don't think would object to the committee, scrapping the paper receipt requirement. But I wanted you to know why we made that recommendation originally and what the rationale for it was. With the $1,000 daily transaction limit, we've sort of said before that we thought this was important. Again, it doesn't eliminate the risk of frauds and scams, right? Most frauds and scams by the numbers involve less than $1,000, right? It's people who think they're buying the rowing machine from Craigslist and paying for it, and it's not there or something like that. And even with the $1,000 daily transaction limit, scams can go on for a really long time. If you think of the romance scam, right, where there's the make-believe girlfriend in some other country, customers might send that fake girlfriend $1,000 every week for months, right? And these things, and it might be many months in the future when they first realize they've been the victim of a scam. So the other point of the daily transaction limits is that the report asked us to address two things. One was the use of crypto kiosks to sort of victimize scam victims in Vermont. So the scammers utilizing this as a method of transmission. But the other was a concern about use of crypto kiosks for illicit purposes. For instance, in the drug trade or other illicit things where money is moving on crypto rails or using these kiosks. The daily transaction limit does go to that too, of introducing some friction or reducing the utility of these machines for certain bad actors beyond scammers, right? So most of what we've talked about is focused on scams, but there really is this other concern with these machines as well. So next I want to talk to the refund provision. I think this is one where probably we have some of the biggest disagreements with CoinFlip, in that what we would like to see is a more robust refund provision, and I'll in line with what we suggested in the report, and actually with a couple additional things added to it that weren't in the report. So the first thing if a kiosk operator has violated something in our statute, they violated the daily transaction limit, they haven't verified that the customer, using the machine, they haven't verified their identity correctly, and that the customer is going to be entitled to a full refund if they've been defrauded. So if there's been a violation of any of the requirements of this section in connection with the fraudulent transaction, that would trigger the full refund requirements. And next we get to this sort of, so that'd be one category of things that gets full refunds. Another category of things that would get full refunds would be if you have sort of the new customers, right? And in this revision, which I think is the Minnesota model that is provided by CoinFlip, your new customers is sort of being defined as, within 72 hours of the customer registering with the crypto kiosk operator. And we used a different measurement point in our report and in our recommendations. We wanted the period to run from the first transaction by that customer, right? The first time that they tender payment to the kiosk. And again, we're thinking of this example where you have people who have been tricked into using existing accounts, right? That have been set up in other states, and that, where the identity was verified, once upon a time. And oftentimes those accounts are from prior victims in other states. They get them to register and then they use that account to victimize somewhere else, to go after someone in another state like Vermont. So we wanted to run from the time of the customer's first transaction in Vermont. And we also asked, rather than it be 72 hours, there's this period of when someone is a new customer, such that any fraudulent transactions during that window, they'd be entitled to a full refund for. AARP suggested 30 days as the window. Our report suggested 7 days. And, what's in the Minnesota model is 72 hours, which is 3 days.
Clarify?
Yeah.
So a new customer signing on, any transaction that is fraudulent within the first X period, whether it be 72 hours or a week or a month, pick your number, would be able to get full refund, including fees.
Yes, that's sort of the basic framework that we
time,
yeah.
in addition to any fraudulent transaction, as long as, or no, like what's
yeah. And I mean, I think there's some other conditions that also apply. So one is, whether it runs from the date of registration or whether it runs from the date of the first transaction. And again, we sort of had it, it would run to any fraudulent transactions that occurred before the end of the period. That's 7 days from the first transaction that a customer has in Vermont. Again, because a lot of accounts set up in other states that are, sort of provided to fraud victims. The other thing has to do with this, what's the time for a victim to report? So what CoinFlip was suggesting, or what's in the current draft, is you've got 14 days to report to law enforcement. Our recommendation was 180 days to report to law enforcement. And again, that's still, you think of like the statute of limitations for one of these fraud things, like 6 months is still very short as that goes to report something happening. And the reason we wanted there to be a longer period is because you have situations where people don't know for many months that they've been a fraud victim because, they thought they just, got out of their bail or something and realized they got, that they got scammed right then. They thought they actually were paying the sheriff's department. And then they read an article in the, 7 days, and they realize, oh God, I got scammed then. So it's not always the case that people realize they've been scammed instantly after hitting send. Sometimes it dawns later. It comes when they're discussing it with, friends, family members, or financial advisors, or seeing, suspicious transactions or things like that. So we had suggested a longer period of time for them to be able to report. Now, that puts more of a burden on the kiosk providers, right? Because they can't just simply hold back the money and not send it until the period's over. They really have to be more sure that these things aren't going to happen, in Vermont because of other things that they've put in place. What I will say is that their liability under this, even under our suggestion, right, is limited. We're talking, if they're complying with the daily transaction limit, should be a max liability per customer of $7,000. Because that should be 7 $1,000 transactions. And if they've done the screening at the $4,000 mark, hopefully they we're able to shut it down before then. So, it's not something where we're putting unlimited liability on the customer. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? If a kiosk provider wasn't able to police and they were allowed a customer to exceed the daily transaction limits because this customer was using multiple accounts, not in their own name, provided by the scammer, their damages, their losses could be much more than $7,000. But again, that's why we wanted our first suggestion was the full refund provision should apply if there's been any violation of the section in connection with the fraudulent transaction. I do want to say that just won't want to spend too much time on it because they agreed to withdraw it, but we strongly oppose the idea of reporting to law enforcement, filing a report, starting an invisible clock that the customer has no idea about, where they have 24 hours to then tell the kiosk operator that they've reported to law enforcement, or they lose their refund rights. It's so uncommon that these are reported. It should never be the case that a customer is worse off because they reported. It's also the case that customers report to a wide array of different sources. Sometimes they're calling their local sheriff. Oftentimes they're reporting to the FBI through an online form, through IC3. I think the FTC has reporting platforms. Sometimes people are reporting to their local police station. Sometimes they're going to the AGO's office or to DFR. DFR and the AGO, if this gets passed, we would know that, okay, if you've reported to us, you've got 24 hours to report it to the kiosk company, and we could tell them that. The FBI is not going to be keeping track of what the time period is for Vermont. They're not going to say, well, have you reported to the kiosk company yet? Because the clock is ticking. And I think a lot of the local law enforcement people doing intake of these things might not be aware of that requirement either. So we wouldn't want people to lose their refund rights because they were unaware that they had to, immediately, that reporting to law enforcement or to an agency like ours would trigger this second reporting requirement to the kiosk provision if they wanted to retain their rights to a refund. So that was one that we strongly disagreed with and didn't want to see. Acknowledging that puts additional burden on the kiosk companies and doesn't leave them with maybe the same ability to do this. I think if we get the report and we know about it, we would of course be happy to inform the kiosk company, and that's our policy, right? When we receive complaints about a licensee, we report those complaints to the licensee. So next thing I just wanted to talk about, if you were going to do this, we'd suggest just putting a definition or a little more fleshing out a little bit what constitutes a fraudulent transaction. One of the things that we sort of mentioned in the report, we want to make it just crystal clear that fraudulent transactions include sort of authorized payments, right? Where the victim is authorizing it's not just, someone moving money without the victim's authority, something where they've, tricked the victim into giving their authority to do this. Another thing that we want to specify is limit any counterclaims or rights of set off on the refund. In almost every single fraud provision, the victim will probably have clicked some box somewhere along the way saying, no one has directed me to come to this thing. And they're, have all this pressure from the scammers to give those false representations and warranties to the kiosk company. But that can't be a get out of jail free card on the refund provision or, reduce the liability. We haven't heard the operators, argue for that, but something that we would want to make clear. Again, just, I think I've touched on this many times, do want to harp on the issue that is the underreporting of these scams, that people feel ashamed of them and they don't, the money's gone. They feel like they don't have a lot of prospects of getting it back. So they don't necessarily report this when they're seeing stuff on the screen, right? They're clicking through where they might get some notice in advance, like, oh, if you're defrauded, you might be entitled to a refund. When these victims are going through these transactions, they are under intense psychological pressure from these scammers. And, a big part of the scammer's technique is, getting these people to cut off the critical thinking in their brain. So they're not necessarily even processing all of the stuff that they're seeing on the screen. That's one of the reasons that we felt strongly about having the refund policy spelled out explicitly on whatever receipt the victim would get, both in electronic and, it's just in paper form. Again, if you decide to allow these to be in the state, you can decide whether or not that paper receipt thing's something you want to do. On the mandatory screening thing, we wouldn't oppose if you wanted to make the mandatory screening for new customers, apply to everyone and not have the cutoff at the I think it was at 60 years of age that we suggested. I was at a regulator conference, within the last 12 months, and there's someone from Byte Federal who was giving a presentation, and they said that this is something that they had done, the mandatory screening by telephone of the customers over 6 years of age before their first transaction. And they said with, some pride that like after those conversations on the phone, I forget if it was 84 or 86, but I'm certain it was over 80% of the customers that they contacted did not go forward with transactions after that. And that's both, indication of the potential effectiveness of the telephonic screening. But it's also like a damning, like when I heard it, it was like jaw dropped, right? 80% of customers are stopping once you do, the in-person fraud screening. I don't know if those, statistics apply everywhere. But again, it just goes back to the point that I led off with when I first sat down. Like, the statistics on this, just on the reported stuff that we know about, are horrendous. So I don't think I had anything more on my list to flag, but I was writing a lot of stuff down. I might remember some other thing that I wanted to mention, but so I want to turn it back to you for any questions you might have.
Questions for Ethan? No?
80% of transactions that get into the fraudulent realm, or are you saying 80% of all of transactions?
No, they were saying that what they said in this presentation was that, when they do the mandatory screening,
So
80% of the customers that they flag for that mandatory screening don't go forward. And that's either because the customers realize they're being defrauded, or they call them, the customers don't, pick up, or they're not willing to provide the additional information that would be needed to satisfy the screening. But they said that was resulting in this huge number of transactions not going forward when they had that intervention.
when the alarm bells go off,
Yes.
then there's a good success rate, which is a good thing. And also to be clear, the element you're referring to about the Attorney General's letter, Appendix C1, that's all cryptocurrency problems, a portion of which is kiosk related, the total financial hit of which is unknown.
Yeah. So what I was saying is this was, so the AGO talks about all of the, the number of cryptocurrency related, scam complaints that they've received. And then they say the percentage of those that involved kiosks. And I believe it was over a third, or maybe it was
14 of 45 where there was a financial loss.
yeah. So I think it was 14 out of 45 transactions where there was a financial loss involved kiosks.
Do we know how many that did not involve a financial loss did involve a kiosk? That wasn't set apart in the letter, but I wasn't sure if you had that.
That I don't know. It's not uncommon that, people receive a scam phone call and they report it.
Yeah.
Receive a scam email or something and they report it to law enforcement. But, those don't often, sometimes that's a reporting without there being a loss, but
Yeah.
there's often less detail about that.
Yeah, Ray never came to that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, raise a real hand and a virtual hand here. So thanks very much for your test. Yeah, I'm behind you again. Thanks very much for your testimony. Is it fair to say, I mean, in so many words, I'm hearing your testimony to say that you would really prefer that these transactions either be subject to a continuing moratorium or a ban. And only if we decide to go through with legislation, you'd want this extended, the number of consumer protections that you've just discussed. Is that an accurate statement?
So, I mean, I don't think it's, the official position of the department or the executive to push for a ban on these, but I think our position is that we would, if the committee or the legislature was to extend the moratorium or to implement a ban, we would have no objections to that.
Okay, thank you. And the second question I had was around the length of period of time of a refund. And I always think of these things as sort of where do you allocate the risk of loss for something that goes bad. And there are lots of ways to do that, the way I've always thought about it. And I wonder if you agree, you try to weigh who has the better opportunity to prevent the loss. And it seems to me as between the operator and the consumer, it would certainly be the operator. Well, and so I'm wondering if you agree with that, and if you have any issue with increasing that refund period to, say, I don't know, 30 days or longer.
Yeah, I mean, I think we wouldn't object to increasing the refund period to 30 days or longer. Having that much exposure might make the business model less viable in Vermont, but a 7-day period might make the business model less viable in Vermont. I can't speak as much to the economics in terms of how that would affect the kiosk operators. In terms of consumer protection, 30 days is more protective, undoubtedly. right? And 7 days is less, and 72 hours is much less than either of those. And I think there's a balancing exercise that you're engaged in, where you're trying to weigh the public good of providing some sort of limited access to these kiosks in the state, and the convenience that provides to consumers, against the risk of harm as mitigated by whatever regulations we put into place. I mean, I think that's squarely in your court to engage in that balancing exercise. What I'd say is personally, and you shouldn't have the expectation that even if what we put in there was a full refund of any customer in Vermont that's subject to a scam, right? That's still not going to cover everyone, right? Because not everyone's going to report it. They're not going to take advantage of the refund requirement. Even something like that, which is far stronger than we have in there. Like, there are still going to be victims in the state who don't get their money back through the refund process. And again, I think that same balancing, right? Is there a good or a convenience to consumers that's being offered that offsets that risk, and whether you can, because as you said, there are some elements of culpability on both sides. Like the consumers, they are in most cases, answering these questions of saying, no one's telling them to come here and doing all these things because they're in the throes of this scam, and sort of the reality distortion that the scammers create around them. There's creating false urgency and things like that.
Thank you.
I think I have a simple question that I just want to clarify on the fees. So it's $5 or 15%, whichever is greater. So am I reading that right?
Yes.
Okay, so if we raise the amount of transaction, we're raising the fees available to the kiosk operator.
Yes, and if you raise the fee limit to 15%,
Yes.
For a financial transaction, that is an exorbitantly high transaction. But there are fixed costs with these that are high, and if they're offering the refund, that's another expense they have to take into account. And if they're doing the blockchain analytics and all this stuff, there are a lot of, if you have it at 3%, you probably can't cover the extra costs of doing these other things that we're requiring. I mean, I think if you allow 15%, again, in the same sense of balancing, you get a downside of it being an extremely high cost for an investment or for moving money, a transmission of money. It's just a lot, right? For if you're moving $1,000 so far, admittedly very low daily transaction limit, that's $150 fee on it. But in our structure, having a $150 fee does provide some protection, right? Because you might be able to get, if you are scammed or something, you can get, and it's outside of the periods where you can get a full refund, you can at least get the fees refunded, and higher fees would mean a higher potential recovery for a victim in that case. So we don't, in our report, I think where we came out on that is we're not recommending to the committee that you should increase the fee limit to 15%. But we say, you should consider, we don't oppose it. And I think it's a fine thing for you to consider in response to the arguments that industry makes for why you might need higher fees to support these additional protections. But a 15% fee on a purchase of an investment, right, extremely high. Or if you're paying 15% on buying and selling stock, it's got to move over 30% before you break even, right? It's a very high fee. And, and again, that comes down to this thing where, back to the original question, balancing the good versus the risk of harm. And if the good is, the convenience of consumers being able to, buy crypto in cash and pay 15% fees, against the potential harm.
And then one other question, if we choose, because I feel like this needs a whole lot more work, my personal opinion, to extend the moratorium, all that means is that no new kiosks can be added to the state, but the 3 that are existing here would continue under the current law.
That's correct.
I just make a couple points. So.
Real quick.
So if DFR had come to me and some of these points we would have negotiated over them, would have these time on them. So, the 72-hour period, we're fine with it being from the first transaction. We just were told by this committee to share the Minnesota language. So if that's something that gets us across the finish line, that's fine. 14 or 30 days, we're comfortable with both of that. If there's been a violation where we haven't checked the ID for someone and they can circumvent the daily transaction limit, we'll refund that. Like, that's fine. We already did that to the Vermont customer who was defrauded. And I just want to address that 80% number that was set by federal. That is like a salacious allegation that is not based in fact. The fact is that was 80% of people didn't return the phone call, right? When you get a phone call from someone random, can you answer it? No, unless you're a scam victim. So the people who aren't answering are the people who are not answering those random phone calls, right? So that's an indication that they're not fraud victims because they didn't answer the random phone call. So also there are bad actors out there in this industry where scammers direct them to the bad actors, right? So I'm not saying that's bite federal, but I'm saying that number is meaningless. And just want to be clear, like, bad actors don't use our kiosks when you especially have to take their ID. So a drug dealer is not going to go to our kiosk, give their ID, get their photo taken, and then buy drugs with it because the government will know that because they've given their ID. So, in 180 days, we would not be able to close our books. People can ask for a refund 180 days after they've transacted. That would be, there's nothing similar in financial services. And lastly, like the 15% fee, I get it, it's high, but you're paying for the convenience of using cash. When you go to a currency exchange at the airport and change dollars for pesos, you're paying 15 to 20%. You could just use your credit card in a company and in a country and not pay any fee, but some people don't have credit cards. Vermont is protecting people's ability to use cash. They should protect people's ability to use cash at kiosks to buy crypto. Otherwise, people cannot participate in the digital economy unless they are sophisticated investors that are buying it through Morgan Stanley or something. So just wanted to make those points.
Okay. So 10 minutes, Vice Chair and I have to go to a meeting. Maria has to drive. And we need to pull this bill out today. So.
So many options.
Your options are do nothing and hope that Senate Finance will do something. If neither of us do anything, the moratorium comes off in July. We extend the moratorium for another year, try to finish working on this. In the meantime, the proponents can go to the Senate and continue to work with DFR to come up to see if there's the ability to come to a solution that the Senate can apply and back to us. Or we can just add language that bans them all together. Or we can stay here at 7, 8, 9 o'clock tonight while everybody sit with DFR and the proponents sit with DFR and try to come up with language that can be supported for a compromise.
I'm not overly opposed to a ban, but if we want to kick the can, I would feel more comfortable about kicking it than to opening it up. If we do nothing, it is opening it up July, you said July 1st? So that's not acceptable in my mind. So, and I'm not overly thrilled about staying here until 7 o'clock to talk about this, and I don't think anybody else is. But I do think that we need to address it on in the future. Does it have to be done by Senate? I don't know. It could be something that we do as a separate bill. But if we need to move 137 out, in my opinion, it would be with either a ban or with the extension of the moratorium. That's where I stand.
I'm just gonna put it out there, committee, it's a straw poll, straw vote. Would you be willing to extend the moratorium for 1 year?
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Can I explain?
Sir, it's 7 minutes.
Yeah, I'd only support a moratorium if for the purpose of time management, the committee's time management, Mr. Chair, you think it's useful to keep working on it. That's, I think, you and Edie and Kirk's call, if you want to keep working on it. I'm not at all comfortable proceeding with enacting language that the department is not comfortable with.
I thought the department was a little more comfortable than it turned out it was. So part of me feels like it seems like it's close. And I'd like to have the opportunity to get there. But if the way is, if we were to support a moratorium, is just the opportunity that Senate could get it across the finish line, have it come back?
Well, and if they can't, then there's still next year to try to work it out. Or the Senate could say, we're done with this and either take the moratorium off, or they can ban.
Their suggestions would come towards us. And I can support the moratorium in the straw poll. Extension of.
I don't think we need, if people support the moratorium, let's raise their hands. And I think, Emily, you support it as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think it's unanimous of the committee here that we're gonna extend the moratorium for 1 year. Give the proponents an opportunity to talk to the Senate. And at the same time, continue to work with DFR. To see if they can come to an agreement that the Senate can support, and then can come back here that we can support. Okay, and Herb and Emily, do you want to use your votes? One of your 3 votes on virtual to vote today?
What, aren't we going to vote on 137 as a whole?
Yes, but Maria has to finish, she has to redraft. And she has to add the Medigap supplement language from that healthcare did to put into this bill as well. So she needs to redraft that, then we'll come back together again, go through the bill one more time, and then vote it.
So the question is, do you want to vote on 137 today using one of your 3 votes?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yes. The answer is yes.
Okay.
If someone could just let me know when it's going to come up again.
Yep. Emily, is that what you want to do as well?
Did I use one of my votes already this week?
We haven't voted on anything yet this week.
Oh, okay, then yeah, I'm good. I'll
Okay.
use it.
All right. So Maria, if you could do the redraft, how long do you think? Okay, the speaker, we're 15 minutes late, is 15 minutes late for our meeting, so we might be able to move this before we go to the speaker, and you all can go home.
All right, nobody talk to Maria. Give her space.
Okay,
Okay.
okay, so let's go off live and we'll come back in approximately